All right, so now we'll talk about the consequences of prejudice, and we'll start with a quote from Sigmund Freud. Please don't tell anybody that I've used Sigmund Freud here, but all right, it's a good quote. It is understandable that the suppressed people should develop an intense hostility toward a cultures whose existence they make possible by their work, but in whose wealth they have too small a share. I like it. In other words, the poor people do all of the work, make the wealth possible, and get very little out of it. And so Sigmund Freud was writing this at a time where, where slavery was still actually something in his historic memory. But we move forward today and we find that this is true of all poor and exploited groups. It's just a true statement. Okay, so in fact, let's remind ourselves about the self-fulfilling prophecies first. Remember a self-fulfilling prophecy. Remember the study where what they did was they gave teachers, grade school teachers, during the summer, they said, "Oh, these 5 students in your class, we tested all the students in your class, and these 5 have given us, test results that indicate that they're ready to bloom. They're just ready to explode, right?" And so what happens is, of course, the teachers, they treated the students in some way. Maybe they gave them a little bit more time or something, and they smiled more when the students got a question right, etc. And this behavior of the teachers then in fact created something in the students that confirmed what the teachers believed. Remember that? Then the students actually did come out better. Now we can apply this to prejudice as well. Okay? So once we categorize, we come to expect the stereotypes of the person. Okay, we already said that. Once we put them into a group, then they take on the characteristics of the group. However, our expectations influence our memories and create our reality. So if we expect someone to be unpleasant, maybe from a stereotype, we will treat them in that way, and they will generally respond accordingly. And now you've got your self-fulfilling prophecy, okay? And so self-fulfilling prophecies are applicable to stereotypes. So subtyping is to make exceptions to the rule. Sure, I believe in the stereotype. Sure, he did. But guess what? 99 others didn't. So you subtype that particular individual as an exception to the rule. Or subgrouping. You might have a stereotype about a particular group of people and go, yeah, but they don't all behave that way. Those that live in my neighborhood are different, though, or something like this. You're going to take the group to which you have a prejudice and sort of slice off a segment of them and make exceptions to the rule based on that slicing of that segment. Well, it turns out that this notion of a self-fulfilling or self-perpetuating prophecy or stereotype can occur to ourselves as well. Okay? We sometimes expect the stereotypes out of ourselves. And so what will happen is that they'll behave in ways that they think they're supposed to behave based on their group membership. And then that, of course, confirms the stereotype that they had. So it's kind of an odd thing that you might literally shoot yourself in the foot by perpetuating the stereotype yourself. Stereotype threat is something that's been studied a lot recently in social psychology. In this, a very classic study, what they did was, here, under my head, they gave equally capable men and women a difficult math test. So these students probably scored the same, very similar on an SAT math portion. So when they were led to believe that there was a gender difference on the test, women scored lower than men. Okay? Confirming the stereotype. Okay? And so lo and behold, just like this, right? Confirming the stereotype. And when they did not make them believe that there was supposed to be a gender difference, it did not happen. So on the left, there was the expectation there should be a gender difference. On the right, there was no expectation there should be a gender difference. Okay? And so the very stereotype creates a behavior that the stereotype was all about. So in somewhere around 1989, they put together the Teen Talk Barbie. It was beautiful. And one of the things, you pull a little string and she says certain things. One of them was, math class is tough. I'm like, what were they thinking? That became a national controversy. That was big news for its time. All right, so there might be a cultural stereotype. For example, women don't do well in math, okay? And so what happens is the stereotype threat. The women fail at that math test. And so what happens is, since they don't do well, where am I? Disidentification with stereotype domain, math isn't important, right? So they perform poorly, and now they think it's not an important thing. And so it's a very interesting idea. I just heard this one on NPR. There was a reporter, right? But she was reporting for an economics newspaper. I don't know what the hell that means, but oh, that's right. She was the economics reporter for the New York Times. And so she said she was at an economics conference, and a guy put out a pretty complex presentation, right? She loved it. It was fascinating. So afterwards, she goes up and she talks to the guy. And she says, "Oh, I would love to get a copy of that presentation. Can you get it for me?" And so apparently what he said was, "Well, the paper, go to my website and you'll find the paper. But there's also, a dumbing down version. Why don't you go find that?" Meanwhile, a male reporter comes up right behind her and basically says the same thing. And he says, "Yeah, the paper's on my website." And doesn't mention anything about the dummy down version. So, alrighty, very interesting. Alright, so prejudice has consequences, absolutely, very negative consequences. So, how do we reduce prejudice? Okay? And so what we find is persuasive communication, because if prejudice is an attitude, we could go back to the attitudes chapter and say, how do we change attitudes, right? You might as well just copy and paste all of that. Well, we find that education can reduce blatant prejudice. Absolutely. You can remove blatant prejudice. In fact, the more you can predict blatant prejudice based on years of education, all right? The more years of education, the less blatant prejudice. But that's not the same as that subtle prejudice, okay? The contact hypothesis is this argument, this belief that this hypothesis, right, literally, under certain conditions, contact between antagonistic groups or groups which have unequal status and which are, etc. So contact between antagonistic groups will reduce prejudice, but anxiety during contact, forget it. It's not going to work, okay? So you have to know. And so what are some of the characteristics for this contact hypothesis to be truthful, I guess? You have to have equal status, socially and economically. So if members of these different groups, antagonistic groups, I didn't make that up. Okay, if the member of these two different groups come into contact where they both have the same social and economic status, it's likely that prejudice will reduce. It has to be close contact, and it has to be sustained. It's not just very temporary. You have to have cooperation, goals in common. When we contact, we become an us. Okay? It's not us versus them, it is us. We together work to achieve the same goal. Okay? So we find social norms that, yeah, you have to be in a situation where the social norms expect equality. And there needs to be the potential that we can be friends, not just team members or something like that, but actual friends. So, with all of that, you can reduce prejudice potentially. Okay, so we'll pick up next time and we'll talk about some aggression, but I bet you we'll talk about love after that. So you just hold your horses and we'll get them all.